Morning, everyone. Today's lecture will be just the morning lecture, and we will be going through lessons of bimetallism.
And you all have copies of that.
This is chapter
3.
Chapter 3. And tomorrow's lectures will be the ratchet. And for those that don't know what a ratchet is, it's something that you use to crank things up and down, sort of like lifting a car, something like that. And the inflationary-deflationary spiral, and linkage, and Kondratyev's long wave cycle. So I'm sure many of you have heard of Kondratyev's cycle. So that will be quite an interesting lesson, no doubt. So, lessons of bimetallism. Over to Professor.
Thank you. We have already talked quite a bit about bimetallism, and there is a lot more here. As you see, this is a big chapter, so I'm just going to give you the highlights. So in the previous couple of lectures we raised the question, mistake or mischief, referring to what happened in the United States Congress in 1873, Coinage Act of 1873, dropped the standard constitutional silver dollar from the list of authorized silver coins and changed the course of history. But this was an unconstitutional act. The only way it could be changed through a constitutional amendment. And the U.S. Constitution prescribes how how such an amendment can be made. It's a complicated and protracted procedure, and they didn't even mention that perhaps it should be referred to constitutional amendment. They just went ahead, made the law, and put it into effect immediately. And this was, as I say, unconstitutional, and the effect didn't become known until after a few years. And the reason was that the silver price, the world price of silver at the time was actually higher than the mint price. And as a consequence, for instance, silver miners, of course, would sell their silver in the open market, in the world market, because they got a better price that way. But you see, if the price of silver starts falling, then at a point it becomes equal to the mint price, and if it falls below that, then it means that the silver miners get a better price if they take their silver to the mint, mint is supposed to be open to silver by constitution, and that's a floor in the price which the silver miners would get for their product. So as I say, in 1873, the market price was still above the mint price, and therefore the silver miners didn't pay any attention. Obviously their intelligence was not very good. They should have found out by reading the legislation that actually silver has been demonetized. The mint has been closed to silver. They discovered that only a few years later. And you can imagine the shock. They were counting on that price, on that floor below the silver price. And when they needed, then it just wasn't there. So when I first wrote about this, I said that there's nothing surprising here. The bimetallic system is a faulty system. It's an unstable system. This flip-flop effect, it cannot be relied on, and it will lead to the demonetization of silver sooner or later, and therefore one shouldn't be surprised. And it was a natural development. It was not government interference in the market. I held that view for quite some time, and as I was thinking about this problem, something bothered me, and I said, no, that's not right, and ultimately I had to change my views. I now hold that it was not a natural development, that silver became definitely number second after gold, and silver got demonetized by a natural process, economic process, a market process. There's no government interference there. That is the view I now hold, but I became more and more suspicious that there's more than that to it, because there was this underhanded way of making the change. I mean, they should have given a conspicuous title to that coinage law of 1873. They should have called it Silver Demonetization Act, or closing the mint to silver, something. But no, just Coinage Act, and then the list, and an omission without any additional information or word of caution that this is a change. Change is the drop of the silver. So this is rather suspicious to me, as I explained. And then I was very pleased when Milton Friedman, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, came out with a similar confession. He said that, like most monetary economists, he had believed that the so-called crime of 1873 was a natural development simply because bimetallism is an unstable system. And therefore, if they don't change it, it will change on its own, because it's unstable and causes further instability as time goes. And he makes an argument that this was also deflation, the demonetization of silver, the end of bimetallism. And that's easy to see, and I agree with him, with Milton Friedman, because a large part, I don't say half, but perhaps close to half of the circulating stock of money was silver. And it was an important part, because all the small purchases were made with silver money, or substitutes of silver money. Only gold was naturally means of exchange for the larger payments. So when you remove something like 50% of the money supply, and it's no longer money, well, that's a shock to the economy, contraction of the money supply, very violent contraction of the money supply, the end of bimetallism, closing the mint to silver, demonetizing silver. These are various ways of describing the event. And indeed, in the year 1873, there was about today we would call a deep recession, but these are more modern terms. There was a business crisis, financial crisis, having to do with shortage of money, scarcity of money. The new addition to the money supply, which should have come from silver, didn't, because of the law of Coinage Act of 1873. So that blew over, that financial crisis, and then Congress, as if a result of the unconstitutional law they passed, had pangs of conscience. They realized that they did something wrong, something they shouldn't have done, demonetized silver, unconstitutional. So they never admitted this openly, but they felt that these miners who were out of luck now because they thought they had a floor, which meant that they could confidently invest in their mines because there was no risk involved due to this lower limit to the silver price, the mint price of silver, and all of a sudden they find that this the floor has been removed from underneath their operation, and as a consequence they had to assume all this unexpected risk. So, as I say, pangs of conscience. Congress made further legislation, and these were called the Silver Purchase Acts. What it meant was that the Treasury, the US Treasury, was obliged by law to buy so much silver every year at the old mint price, which was no longer operational, but the Treasury would buy domestically produced silver at that higher price. It could have bought the silver in the world market at a lower price, but in a way of compensating for the loss of the miners, the higher old mint price was paid. Now, this opened a can of worms because not everybody agreed. Of course, the miners welcomed this, but other people objected, and so on. In the first version, it was almost a re-establishment, almost opening the mint again, reopening the mint again to silver, with the slight change that it had to be domestic silver, not imported silver. And the bill didn't pass. The Senate didn't pass, the House did. Now, the Senate then reconsidered, and the name is not important, but I mentioned it anyhow. Allison, Senator Allison, took the matter into his hands and hammered out a new version of this Silver Purchase Act, which was acceptable to the Senate. And so both houses voted on it and accepted it. And then, surprisingly, the president vetoed the bill. So you see that this is an extremely controversial issue. And then the final outcome was that the Congress overrode the veto, which means that they voted on it for the second time, and they got more than 2/3 of the votes, and that means that the presidential veto was ineffectual. The law stayed. So then, over the years, the Treasury bought this silver, and it looked that everybody is happy. And then in 1890, there was an initiative to have a new Silver Purchase Act. They found that the first Silver Purchase Act was sabotaged by the Treasury. They bought less silver than the law would have wanted it to buy. And then they discussed the issue again, and now this law is known as the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. And this had just as rough a time as the first Silver Purchase Act, because the United States went into another deep recession, financial crisis, in 1890, and it culminated in 1893, which was the beginning of the term of President Grover Cleveland. He was a Democrat, and he just had to act because the Sherman Silver Act had a provision. The provision was like that. When the Treasury bought the silver from the silver mines, as it had to, according to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, then they issued Treasury bills to pay for it. And these Treasury bills were redeemable in gold. And then the community of speculators immediately saw that there is risk-free profit to be made. They bought up the Treasury bills and presented it for gold, and then sent the gold abroad. So the effect of the Silver Purchase Act was that gold was sucked out of the Treasury, and it reached a very critical level. You see, so much of that gold in the Treasury was to back gold certificates and also greenbacks, which were still in circulation but about to be retired. And if the gold is not there, then there's a deficit in gold, then of course the Treasury is bankrupt. So, as I say, the speculators took advantage of the Silver Purchase Act and withdrew the gold from the Treasury, and that threatened the United States with bankruptcy. It had all kinds of unpleasant consequences. So it had to be, something had to be done, and President Cleveland, that was the summer, August of 1893, called Congress back from vacation, that summer vacation, called it back into a special session, and the only point on the agenda was to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. You see, something which doesn't happen very often. You know, recalling Congress from summer recess, that's one thing, and repeal former law. And it all happened, and then they still had the problem of solving or covering the gold liability. And what Cleveland did is he negotiated with J.P. Morgan, the famous Wall Street banker, for a gold loan, extraordinarily large loan. I can't quote the figure now, but it's not important, which the government had to take, and the bankers, a consortium of bankers provided. So the crisis was solved, but this showed that, there was a basic flaw in the monetary system, because the silver demonetization is not just something you throw in and then everything falls into pieces. No, it has such far-reaching consequences that even 20 years after the original Coinage Act, which made that mistake, the country had to fight with recession. Oh, that was, up to that point, the most vicious recession the United States had. Very high unemployment, lots of companies going bankrupt, especially railway companies, and also, they built lots of railways into the mountains where the silver mines were. And some of this construction was still in progress. And of course, all those construction companies as well as the railway companies went bankrupt and causing all kinds of economic pain. Up to that point, the worst depression in the United States. So the storm blew over and they went on, and there was still some silver purchases, and they never sat down and sort out the problem. They just had these band-aid measures to tape over the difficulties. I mentioned Milton Friedman, and he went on and he expressed his opinion, which I agreed with, that the closing of the mint to silver was a mistake, and he goes on in a different direction where I wouldn't follow him. In fact, I criticize him and I point out that the scheme he suggested wouldn't have worked. And I'm just going to leave it to you to read. It's all in that chapter 3. So I don't want to pursue this. Instead,